terrible ghost of the village. It began with a dare. My friends and I had heard the stories about Tamsworth Village, a forgotten settlement deep in the woods, abandoned nearly a century ago after a series of gruesome events. The villagers had spoken of a curse, of a spirit that didn't rest, a wraith that wandered the ruins seeking vengeance. Most dismissed it as local folklore, but for thrill-seekers like us, it was a challenge. You wouldn't last a night there, Jake had teased, smirking as he tossed another log onto the campfire. Everyone chickens out before sunrise. I'll do it, I said, my pride overriding my common sense. The following weekend, armed with flashlights, snacks, and a couple of sleeping bags, we set out. There were 4 of us: Jake, his girlfriend Mia, my best friend Sam, and me. The path to Tamsworth was overgrown, the trees looming like skeletal fingers against the evening sky. As we trudged deeper into the forest, a suffocating silence settled over us. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. Even the rustling of leaves seemed muted. When we finally reached the village, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The ruins were as eerie as they were fascinating. Crumbling cottages with sagging roofs, a well choked with weeds, and a church steeple that jutted crookedly against the skyline. Home sweet home, Jake joked, though his voice wavered. We chose the largest building to set up camp, a 2-story house that must have belonged to the village elder or someone of importance. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of rotting wood and damp earth. "Do you think it's haunted?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Only one way to find out," Jake said, grinning as he pulled out his phone to record. That's when Sam found the journal. It was hidden under a pile of debris in what must have been the kitchen. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. "What is it?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. "A diary," Sam replied, flipping through the pages. "Looks like it belonged to someone named Eliza." We read the entries aloud as the night deepened. They spoke of a woman who lived in the village decades ago. She was a healer, someone the villagers sought for remedies and advice. But when a plague swept through Tamsworth, they turned on her, accusing her of witchcraft. The final entries were scrawled in a frantic hand. "They've come for me. I hear them outside my door, chanting my name. They blame me for the sickness, but it wasn't my doing. I tried to help them. I tried to save them." The last line sent a chill down my spine. "If they kill me, I will not rest. I will make them pay." A sudden crash upstairs made us all jump. "What the hell was that?" Mia whispered, clutching Jake's arm. "Probably just a raccoon," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's check it out," Sam said, grabbing his flashlight. I didn't want to go, but I wasn't about to stay downstairs alone. We climbed the rickety staircase, each step groaning under our weight. The second floor was colder, the air sharp and biting. At the end of the hallway, a door hung ajar. The crash came again, followed by a low, guttural moan. Jake pushed the door open, revealing a room in complete disarray. Furniture lay overturned, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, as if something had clawed at them. Then we saw it. A shadow in the corner, hunched and shuddering. "Who's there?" Jake demanded, his voice cracking. The figure turned, and I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't human. Its eyes were black voids, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones. The mouth opened in a scream, though no sound came out. We bolted. Chaos erupted as we scrambled down the stairs. Mia tripped, falling hard, but Jake pulled her up, dragging her toward the exit. The door slammed shut before we could reach it. "What's happening?" Mia cried, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," Jake shouted, pounding on the door. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay. The whispers started then, soft at first but growing louder, overlapping until they were deafening. "Leave this place." Sam grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the kitchen. "The back door," he shouted. We ran, but the house seemed to stretch on forever. The kitchen door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of wood. The whispers turned to screams, The shadow appeared again, materializing from the darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, its hollow eyes fixed on us. Jake threw a chair at it, but the object passed through as if the shadow weren't there. "We're going to die here," Mia sobbed. "Shut up," Jake snapped, though his own fear was palpable. "Wait," I said, remembering the journal. Eliza's journal. It said she wouldn't rest. What if she's the one doing this? "What do you want us to do? Apologize to her ghost?" Jake shouted. "No," I said, my mind racing. "We have to find her grave. She said she'd make them pay if they killed her. Maybe we can stop this." Sam nodded. "The church. She's probably buried there." The journey to the church was a nightmare. The air outside was thick with fog, and the trees seemed to close in around us. Shadows darted in and out of sight, accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. When we reached the church, the doors swung open on their own. The pews were overturned, and the altar was covered in cobwebs. In the center of the room was a single grave, the earth above it undisturbed. The headstone read, "Eliza Hawthorne." "What now?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "We dig," I said, grabbing a rusted shovel that lay nearby. The ground was hard, but adrenaline drove us. As we dug, the whispers grew louder, the air colder. Finally, the shovel hit something solid. We uncovered a coffin. Its wood rotted and splintered. "Open it," Jake said. I hesitated, but then pried the lid off. Inside was a skeleton, its bony hands clutching a book bound in human skin. The whispers turned to screams as the skeleton began to move. "Destroy it," Sam shouted. I grabbed the book, my hands trembling. The moment I touched it, a searing pain shot through me, and visions flooded my mind. Flames, angry villagers, and Eliza's final moments. "You must let me rest," a voice echoed in my head. Without thinking, I threw the book into the flames of a nearby lantern. The fire roared unnaturally high, consuming the book and the skeleton. The screams faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When the flames died, the fog lifted, and the oppressive air vanished. We left the village that night, vowing never to return. But sometimes, in the still of the night, I hear the whispers again, and I wonder if we truly set her free. The Curse of Black Hollow Village. When I first heard about Black Hollow, it sounded like another ghost story. The type of urban legend teenagers whispered at parties to scare each other. They said it was cursed, a village swallowed by darkness after a betrayal so foul that even the dead couldn't forget. The elders in the neighboring town claimed no one who ventured into Black Hollow ever came back the same, or at all. It was Sam's idea to investigate. "Come on, Aaron," he said, grinning as we sat in the dingy diner near our college campus. "A haunted village? We have to check it out. Imagine the stories we could tell." I didn't want to go, but peer pressure is a hell of a thing. So, with a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, I found myself climbing into Sam's battered old truck alongside Kara and Nate. We had no idea what was waiting for us. The drive to Black Hollow took hours, the roads narrowing as we ventured deeper into the woods. The moon hung low in the sky, its light barely penetrating the dense canopy above. By the time we arrived at the outskirts, the air had turned icy, and an unnatural silence blanketed the area. The village was a shadow of what it must have been. Crumbling stone cottages leaned precariously, their windows shattered and roofs caved in. We parked near what appeared to be an old well, its wooden frame warped with age. "This is it," Sam said, hopping out of the truck. He was practically vibrating with excitement. "It's creepy," Kara muttered, hugging her jacket tighter around her. "That's the point," Nate said with a nervous laugh. I stayed silent, my stomach twisting in knots. Something felt wrong. We began exploring, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Each building we entered was worse than the last. Empty shelves filled with rotting furniture and graffiti left by other foolhardy visitors. "Check this out," Sam called, pointing to a faded mural on the wall of what might have been a church. The painting depicted a woman with hollow eyes and flowing black hair. Her hands were outstretched, and shadowy figures knelt before her. Beneath the mural, words were scrawled in an unfamiliar script. "What does it mean?" Kara asked. "I don't know," Sam said, snapping a picture. "But she's probably the ghost everyone talks about." The legend, as Sam recounted it, went like this. Decades ago, the villagers had betrayed one of their own, a healer named Mariella. She had tended to the sick and injured, asking for nothing in return. But when a plague swept through the village, the people turned on her, accusing her of witchcraft. They burned her alive in the center of the square. Her dying curse doomed the village to ruin, and her spirit remained, bound to Black Hollow, seeking vengeance. "Maybe we should leave," I said, unease crawling up my spine. "Come on, Aaron," Sam said, rolling his eyes. "Don't tell me you're scared of a ghost story." But it didn't feel like just a story anymore. As we wandered deeper into the village, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air was thick and damp, and the faint scent of burning wood lingered. That's when we saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the square. "Did you see that?" Kara whispered, gripping my arm. "It's probably just an animal," Nate said, though his voice trembled. But it wasn't. A figure stepped into the light of our flashlights. A woman, her face pale and featureless, her hair floating as if underwater. She didn't walk, she glided. "Oh my God," Kara whimpered. Sam, of course, did the dumbest thing imaginable. "Hey," he shouted, stepping forward. "Are you Mariella?" The figure stopped. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then her head tilted, and her hollow eyes locked onto us. The screams started. Not ours, at least not yet. It was as if the air itself was screaming, the sound piercing and inhuman. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Kara's hand. We bolted, darting through the maze of crumbling buildings. The screaming followed us, echoing from every direction. My flashlight flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the beam returned, I saw her. Mariella was standing in the doorway ahead, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Turn back!" I yelled, shoving Nate toward another path. We regrouped near the well, panting and terrified. "She's toying with us," Nate said, his face pale. "What do we do?" Kara asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Sam snapped, pacing. Maybe we can reason with her." "Reason with a ghost?" I snapped. "Are you insane?" But Sam was already moving toward the center of the square, where an ancient stone altar stood. We followed reluctantly, too afraid to stay behind. "Listen," Sam called out, raising his hands. "We're sorry for what happened to you. We didn't mean to disturb your rest." For a moment there was silence. Then Mariella appeared. This time her form was clearer. Her skin was cracked and blackened, as if burned. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Sorry," she hissed, her voice a low growl that echoed unnaturally. "You think sorry will undo what was done?" Her words were like knives, each one slicing into my mind. The ground beneath us trembled, and shadows began to writhe around the square. The well spewed black mist that coiled and twisted like living tendrils. "We have to go," I shouted, grabbing Sam's arm. He didn't move, frozen in terror as Mariella extended a hand toward him. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him. Sam let out a blood-curdling scream as his body contorted, his skin blistering and cracking as if he were burning from the inside out. "Sam!" Kara screamed, but it was too late. He collapsed, lifeless, the shadows retreating. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Kara and Nate toward the truck. Mariella's laughter followed us, a chilling sound that made my blood run cold. We stumbled into the truck, slamming the doors shut as Nate fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the overgrown path, the village disappearing into the darkness behind us. But the shadows didn't stop. They pursued us, clinging to the edges of our headlights. "We're not going to make it," Nate muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Yes, we will," I shouted, gripping the dashboard. When we finally burst out of the forest, the shadows vanished. The truck skidded to a halt on the empty highway, and we sat in stunned silence. Sam was gone, But the nightmare wasn't over. That night, I dreamt of Mariella. She stood at the foot of my bed, her hollow eyes boring into mine. "You can't run," she whispered. "You can't escape." When I woke, the scent of burning would lingered in the air, and I knew she wasn't done with us. The Curse of Hollowbriar Village. When I first heard about Hollowbriar Village, I didn't believe the rumors. It sounded like the sort of ghost story kids made up to scare each other. A village abandoned decades ago after its inhabitants vanished overnight, cursed by a betrayed spirit who still haunted its crumbling streets. But when my friend Mike suggested we investigate, I shrugged and agreed. "It's just a dead village," he said with a grin. "Probably nothing but raccoons and rotten wood. What's the worst that could happen?" The four of us, Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, our friend Rachel, and me, piled into Mike's beat-up SUV on a chilly October evening. The sky was painted in hues of deep purple and orange as the sun set behind the hills. Hollowbriar lay an hour outside of town, surrounded by dense woods and forgotten by time. By the time we reached the village, the sun had fully set, leaving only the moon and our flashlights to guide us. The village was eerie, to say the least. Wooden houses sagged under the weight of decades, their windows dark and lifeless. The air was damp and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my skin crawl. "It's just a bunch of old buildings," Mike said, leading the way with his flashlight. "People are scared of nothing." "Yeah, nothing," Sarah muttered, sticking close to his side. Rachel stayed quiet, but her grip on her flashlight was white-knuckled. Couldn't blame her. Something about the place felt wrong. We wandered through the village, poking our heads into empty houses and overgrown courtyards. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No wind rustled the trees, no insects chirped. It was as if the village existed in a vacuum, cut off from the natural world. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to an old stone well in the village square. The wooden cover had rotted away, leaving the mouth gaping like a hungry void. "I dare you to drop a rock down there," Mike said with a smirk. Sarah rolled her eyes but complied, picking up a stone and tossing it into the darkness. We waited, straining to hear it hit the bottom. It never did. "Creepy," Rachel whispered, stepping back from the well. "It's just deep," Mike said, though his grin faltered. "Let's keep moving." We entered what looked like the village church next. The building was small, with a steeple that leaned at a precarious angle. Inside, the pews were overturned, and the altar was covered in thick layers of dust. "Guys," Rachel said, pointing to the wall. A faded mural covered the back of the church. It depicted a woman with long, dark hair and a pale, almost skeletal face. Her eyes were black voids, and she held a flaming torch in one hand. Around her, villagers cowered, their faces twisted in fear. Below the mural, a message was scrawled in jagged, red letters. "She will come for you." "That's not ominous or anything," I said, my voice shaky despite my attempt at humor. "Who's she?" Sarah asked. "Probably the ghost," Mike said, snapping a picture of the mural with his phone. "You know, the one who cursed the village." According to local legend, Hollowbriar's downfall began with a woman named Eleanor, a healer who lived on the outskirts of the village. She was revered at first, her remedies saving lives and her advice guiding the community. But when a string of misfortunes struck, crop failures, sickness, and a child's disappearance, the villagers turned on her. They accused her of witchcraft, dragging her to the square where they burned her alive. Her final words were a curse, damning the village to rot in darkness forever. We left the church, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The air felt thick, pressing against my chest. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the reach of our flashlights, and every creak or rustle set my nerves on edge. "Let's check out one more building," Mike suggested. "Then we'll head back." We entered what appeared to be the village elder's house. It was larger than the others, with 2 stories and a grand, albeit decayed, staircase. "Why do I feel like we're pushing our luck?" Rachel muttered as we climbed the stairs. "Because you're a wimp," Mike teased, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The upstairs hallway was narrow and lined with doors. Most of them were jammed shut, but one at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar. Inside, the room was sparse, containing only a wooden bed frame and a dresser. But on the floor, carved into the wooden planks, was a large symbol, a circle surrounded by jagged runes. "What the hell is that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Some kind of ritual thing?" I guessed, though I didn't want to linger long enough to find out. Suddenly, Rachel's flashlight flickered, casting the room in strobe-like flashes. "That's not funny," she said, smacking it against her palm. "I didn't do anything," Mike said. Then we heard it. A whisper. Low and guttural, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Let's go," I said, backing toward the door. The whisper grew louder, transforming into a wailing scream that rattled the walls. The symbol on the floor began to glow, a sickly red light seeping through the cracks. And then she appeared, the woman from the mural, Eleanor. She rose from the glowing symbol, her body flickering like a flame. Her face was hollow and sunken, her eyes pits of darkness that seemed to pull at my very soul. "Leave," she hissed, her voice layered with the screams of 100 tormented souls. "You are not welcome here." We bolted, tripping over each other in our panic. The house seemed to stretch and warp, the staircase twisting impossibly as we ran. By the time we stumbled outside, the village had transformed. Shadows loomed larger, stretching like claws. The well bubbled with black sludge, and the air was filled with the sound of distant screams. "She's not going to let us leave," Rachel sobbed, clutching my arm. "Get to the car," Mike shouted. We ran, but Eleanor followed. Her form flickered in and out of existence, appearing ahead of us one moment and behind us the next. When we reached the SUV, Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking too much to unlock the door. "Hurry up," Sarah screamed, glancing over her shoulder. Eleanor was gliding toward us, her mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin. The engine roared to life, and we tore down the dirt path, the village disappearing behind us. But the relief was short-lived. The road began to change, twisting and looping back on itself. No matter how far we drove, we ended up back in the village square. "It's a loop," Mike said, panic in his voice. "We can't get out." Eleanor appeared in front of the car, her black eyes piercing through the windshield. The engine died, and the lights flickered out. Her voice echoed in my head, "You'll never leave." And as the shadows closed in, I realized she wasn't lying. The Wraith of Weatherby Hollow. They warned us about Weatherby Hollow. Every old-timer in town had a version of the story, each more terrifying than the last. The village had once been a thriving settlement, they said, nestled deep in the woods, but it had been abandoned a century ago under mysterious circumstances. No one knew exactly why, but everyone agreed on one thing. A malevolent spirit roamed the hollow. "Don't go there," my grandfather had warned me when I was a kid. "Not unless you want her to follow you home." Of course, those warnings only made it more tempting. So, when my friends Matt, Sarah, and I were brainstorming ideas for a documentary project, Weatherby Hollow seemed like the perfect subject. "It's probably just an overgrown ghost town," Matt said as he packed his camera gear. "A few creepy buildings, maybe a graveyard. Perfect for a spooky vibe. Let's just hope we don't run into her," Sarah added with a nervous laugh. I didn't say anything, but my stomach churned. Something about the idea of going to Weatherby felt wrong. We set out on a cold October morning, driving 2 hours into the wilderness until the road turned into a narrow dirt path. The GPS lost signal long before we arrived, but Matt had printed out old maps he found online. The forest grew thicker as we approached, the trees pressing in like dark sentinels. Finally, we reached the edge of Weatherby Hollow. The village was a husk of its former self. Moss-covered houses leaned precariously, their windows shattered and doors hanging from rusted hinges. A crumbling church stood at the center, its steeple tilting dangerously. The air was damp and still, carrying a faint, acrid scent I couldn't place. "This is amazing," Matt said, already filming. "Creepy as hell, but amazing." "Too quiet," Sarah muttered, clutching her coat tighter. "I don't like it," I didn't like it either, but I didn't want to be the coward. We started exploring, sticking close together as we moved from house to house. Most were empty, filled with little more than rotting furniture and the occasional animal nest. But in one, we found a strange altar. A wooden table covered in melted candles, with what looked like bones scattered across its surface. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Probably some kids messing around," Matt said, though he didn't sound convinced. He filmed the altar anyway, zooming in on the scratches etched into the table's surface. The markings were symbols, circles, triangles, and something that looked like an eye. "Creepy," Sarah muttered, backing away. We left the house quickly, the unease settling deeper into my chest. The church was our next stop. It was the largest building in the village, its heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. Inside, the air was colder, and the faint scent of decay lingered. Rows of rotting pews faced an altar at the far end, where a large cross hung upside down. Beneath it, words were carved into the stone floor. "She sees all." "This is starting to feel less like an abandoned village and more like a horror movie," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's just graffiti," Matt said, though he didn't seem as confident as before. Then we heard it, a whisper. Low and guttural, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "It's just the wind," Matt said quickly, though there was no wind. We left the church in a hurry, stepping into the fading daylight. The sky had darkened, thick clouds blotting out the sun. "I think we've got enough footage," I said. "Let's head back." But Matt wasn't ready to leave. "One more shot," he insisted, pointing to the graveyard behind the church. The graveyard was overgrown, with tombstones leaning at odd angles. Most of the inscriptions had worn away, but one stood out. It was newer than the others, and the name was still legible. Anora Weatherby. "Who's Anora?" Sarah asked. "Probably the ghost," Matt said with a grin. "The Lady of Weatherby Hollow. Let's get this shot," and he stopped mid-sentence, his smile fading. "What's wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer, just pointed. I turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the graveyard. She was tall and gaunt, her hair a tangled mess that fell over her face. Her clothes were tattered, and her skin was pale as death. But it was her eyes, or the lack of them, that sent a chill down my spine. Empty sockets stared back at us, black as the void. Who's there?" Matt called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. We backed away, but as we turned to leave, the figure was suddenly in front of us. She hadn't walked. She hadn't moved. She was just there. The air grew thick, and the acrid scent from earlier was overwhelming now, like burning flesh. "Leave," the figure hissed, her voice layered with something inhuman. "We're sorry," I stammered. "We didn't mean to." "Leave," she screamed, her voice shaking the ground beneath us. We ran. The village seemed to twist around us as we fled, the buildings looming impossibly tall. No matter which way we turned, we ended up back at the church. "She's not letting us leave," Sarah sobbed, her breath coming in short gasps. "We'll find a way," Matt said, though his voice trembled. The figure appeared again, this time at the church doors. Her hollow eyes burned with malice, and her skeletal hand pointed at us. "You took what was mine," she growled. "Now you will stay." "We didn't take anything," Matt shouted. Her gaze shifted to his camera, and realization dawned. "Give it to her," I yelled. Matt hesitated, clutching the camera. But when she stepped closer, he threw it to the ground. The camera shattered, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She vanished. The village returned to its silent, lifeless state. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, and even then, none of us spoke as we sped away. It wasn't until we got back home that we realized the camera's memory card was missing, and every night since, I've seen her in my dreams, standing at the edge of my bed, waiting,